None of these things are mutually exclusive. That Donald Trump was in bed with Russia, China, Saudi, Egypt. That the Steele dossier and Alpha Bank story were massively corrupt joint Israeli-Russian intelligence operations. That Barr is a traitor. And that the Durham investigation has some things to teach us about FBI corruption, especially since we just arrested the former head of FBI Counterintelligence in the New York field office, who was head there during the 2016 campaign. All these things can be true, and we're going to talk about them right now. Guys, it's time for some game theory. Hey there, it's Eric Garland back again with Game Theory. Today, we're going to be talking about the head of FBI Counterintelligence in New York being arrested for being a foreign agent. Before we get into that, I'd like you to hit subscribe. We have a bunch of new videos coming up, probably about the Durham investigation, probably about the fallout from DOJ being penetrated by foreign agents, and also our upcoming series on 18 intelligence agencies, how they work, and no doubt the news cycle is going to fill up time and lots of things you have questions about. So please hit subscribe. It's great so far. Let's get into it. I'm going to try and make this video like not 9 hours because this is a topic I could talk about a long time. We've had two events that have hit the airwaves pretty close to each other. One, we find out this guy, Charles McGonigal, who was head of FBI counterintelligence in the New York field office, which was probably the #1 Russia-focused field office in terms of criminal and counterintelligence matters, that guy McGonigal was on the payroll of Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, which is generally bad if your job is to catch Russian spies to be on the Russian payroll. I think we all get that, even amateurs, right? It's especially interesting when you figure out that Paul Manafort was also on the payroll of Oleg Deripaska for many years. In fact, he went into the Trump campaign owing Deripaska money. So if you're wondering how we got a foreign agent in the White House, maybe the fact that we had some high-level Department of Justice employees actually working for the Russians, maybe that gives some insight. Now, the other thing that's hit the news, and this is just in the last 24 hours, apparently John Durham, a legendary prosecutor and rooter out of corruption in FBI and DOJ, it's looking like he's getting closer to putting out his public report that explains what his investigation has been up to for now almost 4 years. And there's this huge immune response in the news that this whole John Durham thing, it's all just a big setup by William Barr, and who knows how it's gone on this long, and it's just, there's nothing you want to hear there. There's blah, 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 blah. See no evil, hear no evil, smell no foreign agents or nothing. Which is interesting because some of the people making these assessments probably ought to know better. But here's the deal. John Durham, who you may know from his work in New England, he helped root out corruption connected to a mobster by the name of Whitey Bulger. They had a bunch of corruption in the FBI as well as New England State Police. John Durham was a legendary prosecutor who took those guys out. He took on the Irish Republican Army terrorists. He took on, hitmen, mob bosses. The guy has no fear. And, frankly, he's a great guy to tap if you think something's been up in an FBI prosecution, because he has a lot of experience on how things are supposed to run and how they go badly when either organized crime and or hostile foreign intelligence agents get in the mix. He's the guy. So he's been looking at the origins of the Russia investigation, which is an interesting frame to begin with, because how long has America been investigating Russian influence? Well, about 100 years, because, they're very aggressive with all that spy stuff. You may have seen Boris and Natasha, Moose and Squirrel, and or a zillion spy movies. Or, just if you read up at all on the history of Russia's attempts to interfere in foreign elections, Comintern, it was very overt prior to Stalin. Stalin figured out they're being a little bit loud about it and took it more underground. But these guys have been meddling in elections all over the world for as long as the modern Russian intelligence function has been out there. So what are the origins of Russian intelligence investigation in America? Russia. That's the origin. But more recently, there was an investigation that was initially started by then Attorney General William Barr. And he tapped the then U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, guy named John Durham, to go look at how the investigation into Trump and Russia was started. And ever since, that investigation has been characterized as something that's inherently nefarious. And sure enough, there was a lot of media influence on the right side trying to characterize it as something they just loved. Oh, we're going to get you. The whole thing was completely bogus. There was no connection between Trump and Russia. And then on the left side, you have, boo, this must be very bad because the investigation into Trump and Russia, which, as we just said by talking about what was going on at the FBI office in New York City, probably had a couple bumps in it, since there's guys on there that ended up being exposed for violating sanctions for being on the Russian payroll. So let's just admit that maybe not everything went super great in that investigation, right? For the fact that we even had a guy in that position who was able to become president and enter the White House. Maybe mistakes were made, right? But so on the left side, it's like, boo! Everything went fine, and everything you've heard has gone great. And in reality, it's much more complicated, which is that there was a lot of corruption on all sides of that trade. Trump was, in fact, influenced by Russia. He did, in fact, ask for help from Russia. He did get it. And he was also embedded with a number of other countries. And the investigation into the whole thing was a dog's breakfast. The whole thing was very, very messy. And it kind of goes from, the time frame goes from like 2016 to the modern day. And like I said, I don't want this to be a 7-hour video because there's so much I could talk about. But I do want to get into what the timeline was. Like, do you guys even remember how long you've been thinking about Trump and Russia? Because I do, because I ended up getting involved in it. So right now I want to take you back to the dewy slopes of early 2016, when you may have heard about Trump having something to do with Russia for the first time. Let's go through that timeline, and then maybe we can look at what Durham was investigating, and you ask yourselves whether or not that was a worthwhile thing to investigate. But first, let's go to the timeline. So if you're older, you probably remember where you were when JFK was shot. If you're a bit younger, you might remember where you were on September 11th, 2001, when the towers fell. And you might also remember the part where you initially said, wait a minute, this Trump guy has something to do with Russia. That was a whole lot more subtle than the first two events, but they're no less important as these things go forward. I'll tell you, I know where I was when I went, wait a minute, there's a real problem here with Trump and this one country, Russia. Of course, if you know Trump's background, the fact that he's organized crime was already a problem. The fact that he had rented out an entire floor of Trump Tower to the Saudis for years was a problem. If you tracked any of his stuff around the Miss America pageant, or any of his stupid businesses, this was not an ideal candidate for president of the United States by any means. But during the 2016 campaign, Russia became a particular sticking point. And I remember very specifically, I believe it was his town hall with Matt Lauer, and they get talking about world leaders, and Donald Trump comes out and says that he prefers Vladimir Putin to Barack Obama as a leader. In general, strong guy, smart guy, he just likes him better than the current president. Now, if anybody is in the intelligence world listening to this at that moment on TV, to a potential presidential candidate, listening to that kind of talk was incredibly alarming. That's what set my hair on fire. And I talked to a lot of my colleagues. This is way back early spring 2016. And I was like, hey, what's up with this? Because in terms of statecraft, we don't make comment on other leaders, especially if somebody's going to be head of state. Because, you're going to have to deal with that country no matter which political party gets in. It's why we don't interfere with each other's political elections and make comments on politics in their countries, principally because we usually don't understand exactly what's going on over there, but mostly because we have to be friends, or we have to relate to that country, even if we're not friends, no matter which party is in power. Do we have our preferences? Absolutely, in general, and sometimes they're even the right preferences to have. But during election campaigns, we do not express opinions. And there's an old saying, it's really stopped the last few years, but that politics stops at the shore. So, where any other country is involved, it becomes diplomacy and not politics. And you don't mix these two. Well, Donald Trump, he broke all the other rules. Why not this one too? He says, oh no, I have my preferred leader, and he's a dictator. This is very, very alarming. So for me, I start talking to my friends in the intelligence community going, what's up? And I get reminded, hey, go look up some of his background. And it did not take long. It was like, oh, this guy's got a problem. And as I said before, Saudi, China, he's got problems all over the place. But he's got a special bunch of deals going with the Russians, and this stuff starts to look alarming. Now, the year goes on. You get to the middle of the year, people start becoming aware of a guy named Paul Manafort. Now, Paul's a guy from New Britain, Connecticut, and his family has a construction company, and there's some interesting parts of the family's activities. For some reason, Manafort Construction was Johnny on the spot. They got the sole contract to excavate the World Trade Center. That's pretty interesting. Also, they stepped up when Adam Lanza shot up Sandy Hook in late 2012. Manafort Brothers was there to break down, to excavate Adam Lanza's house for free. All that's kind of weird. But in the modern day, what the Washington cognoscenti thought about Manafort was, well, this is something I heard from my network. What, that guy? That guy's still, he's running a campaign? He'd been off, look, this is a guy who was partners with Roger Stone. They ran the torturer's lobby. He represented Ferdinand Marcos's interests. I think Mobutu Sese Seko. Every kind of dictator you can imagine, that was Paul Manafort's dream clientele. And his most recent client had been a guy named Viktor Yanukovych in the Ukraine, who really represented Vladimir Putin's interests. So the fact that that dude was in the United States, no longer doing Eastern European politics, but doing American politics for this mob dude from Queens, well, all this was very, very alarming. So the summer goes on, and actually it becomes more public knowledge that this guy's got Russia ties. He steps aside in favor, of a real cool customer that we could all get along with, Steve Bannon. Totally nothing creepy about that guy at all. But so Manafort steps back, but the Russia stuff continues. By the end of summer or so, you've got Donald Trump is talking about how, hey, Russia, if you're listening, we'd love to get Hillary's emails there. Now, it's one thing to say that you prefer a politician from another country. It's bad, but, it could always get worse. You could just come right out and ask a hostile foreign intelligence service to help your political campaign, which he did. And then they did. They came out with propaganda and hacked materials that they gave to the U.S. media, which was only too happy to talk about this stuff, as if it didn't even need checking, as if they couldn't talk to anybody from the intelligence services that would say, yo, we don't run stories based on that stuff, because the classic techniques are you take something out, you leave some stuff in that you like, and you add some stuff that's fake entirely. So that's why we don't generally allow foreign intelligence services to act as sources for our media. But there we are. And as you recall, then we get into the debates. Those are a whole other traumatic issue for lots of us having to watch those things. But you get to October 16, and there's a lot going on. You get some stories that creep out into the public consciousness that are coming, we now know, from a couple operatives, Glenn Simpson from Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele, who was an MI6 officer, they'd been putting together this thing that has now become known as the Steele dossier. And they were shopping it to journalists during the campaign, and some were biting on this. So we're starting to read in, I believe, Mother Jones and Yahoo, and eventually Slate and New York Times, stories about Donald Trump's relationship to Russia. Principally, Michael Liskoff and David Korn were writing about, yes, he's got some Russia ties in there. Slate runs a story about how there's maybe some communications between a server at Trump Tower and Alpha Bank, which is a bank in Russia known to be connected to the Russian mob. So that story makes it out. And then the New York Times comes out and takes a completely different angle and says that according to the FBI, now I don't believe they've identified their sources, but remember, the head of counterintelligence at the FBI was working for the Russians eventually, that investigating Trump, the FBI found no links whatsoever between Trump and Russia, which, if you'd seen where he had just held his Miss Universe contest, you expect the FBI to be at least as good as a rudimentary Google search. And so then we have the setup for the next few years. November 8th comes up, and of course, we're all shocked. Trump actually wins. And there's a few more Russia-related events that happen like right off that freak some of us out quite a bit. Russia celebrates his win, and in fact, they make Trump a Cossack of the Russian Empire, like right away, next day or within a week. They give him the highest civilian honor possible. They really embrace him. And if you recall, that period of time is very chaotic. It wasn't very clear who was going to run the White House or nothing. So much so that we were starting to see some of the foreign connections seep out there. He goes to hire this guy, Mike Flynn, who had been head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that everybody in my community of intelligence was like, whoa, that guy's back too? And they were going to make him National Security Advisor. And while that's all forming up, yours truly, December 11th, 2016, I've collected my own open source intelligence for the month before that, based on my years of experience, sometimes getting targeted by the Russians myself. Definitely my last year of going, wait, we don't say we like Vladimir Putin on the debate stage. That's not done. But in the month after the election, takes me about 30 days of getting about 1 hour sleep per night, I come out with this thread on Twitter. It starts out, hey guys, I'm hearing this meme that Obama and Clinton have just given up. Hey guys, it's time for some game theory, which is not the title I would have picked ultimately, but I was just shotgunning the whole thing. And I was thinking about, hey, we need to approach this like strategic tabletop gaming at the Pentagon, which is assign every country their own team and play as that team. You ask yourself in strategic gaming, not at Nash equilibrium type game theory or economic game theory or anything. Sorry, economists, I know some of you, filled your Pampers over that one. But if you're doing strategic simulation gaming a la Pentagon style, you each take a team, you get your briefing book, you learn as much as you can about what's really going on with that country. You try and understand where they're coming from, what their goals are, and you go around and you say, okay, this thing happens, and everyone takes a turn. It's a little like Risk, essentially. So I decided to do that as the Russians go, well, what are the Russians up to right now? What do they want? Though they've been drastically reduced in stature, they're very powerful. They have really good covert operations, which I still stand by. Clearly, they had the head of our FBI Counterintelligence in New York. I mean, those guys can dunk. I mean, like, look, Shaq doesn't have a bunch of disrespect for LeBron James, right? These guys can both ball, but you have to respect the other team that can dunk and drain three-pointers from the outside. You know what I'm saying? So I just got on Twitter and just started talking about, okay, let's just talk. So we could start anywhere, but let's start at influence operations. And unlike a lot of what's come up in the disinformation analysis space online in the open source, I started on the left and not the right. Between you and me, I thought Fox News and that stuff was just a little too obvious. Why start with Fox News? We all know it is foreign influenced garbage. Let's start on the left with WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and all them. What was the goal of that? It was to create disharmony and get distrust between Americans and their intelligence services and their military. And look, we just had, all these years, 16 solid years in Iraq and Afghanistan. These things had not gone well. There was a lot of distrust about what was said was intelligence. It really kind of wasn't, or wasn't very accurate. I mean, there's a lot of distrust there. And the WikiLeaks operations really fanned the flames on that. So I started there. And of course, WikiLeaks had a lot of help from the Russians and others, by the way. And then you go over to the right side and you look at that. So I wrote this thread and it kind of blows up. And some 10 million people saw it. And it got an immediate negative reaction. But it happened to be 3 days after President Obama had ordered a full assessment from the intelligence community. Three agencies in particular, NSA, CIA, and FBI, on what the hell just happened. There was very clearly a lot of foreign influence. Now, what came out about a month later, on January 10th, 2017, was the delivery of a report, a fairly rudimentary report about Russian influence operations. And there had been a ton of Russian influence operations. I mean, hell, the guy who just won the White House asked for them. He asked for influence operations from the Russians, and wouldn't you know it, they obliged. I mean, look, if you were in Russian intelligence position, wouldn't you, guy who's going to be president, who will look super bad if you do that thing, and you kind of have him in your pocket, as if you don't already, through having bought his house for twice the price, through Dmitry Rubovlev down in Florida a few years ago. You have all these levers on the dude that do not involve girls peeing on him, by the way. You have real leverage like money and knowledge of how businesses are set up, all that. Dude begs you for help, you give them the help. That's another lever you can use on them. So they do that. Are there other countries like, Israel and Saudi and others that are trying to influence Trump that have intelligence operations going? You betcha. Absolutely. But, probably the strongest influence on the 2016 election were those Russian influence ops, especially the cyber operations, the operations through social media. So the intelligence community does an assessment. That means drop everything and analyze this one topic as much as you possibly can. And they came out and they said, yeah, there is a lot of Russia here. Now, it was January 10th, 2017, when they report to Congress. Now, something else happens on that day. BuzzFeed publishes a document that was handed to them on background that turns out was itself a foreign intelligence operation, and that was the Christopher Steele dossier, which, for those of us in the world of intelligence who produce human intelligence, that is, not intelligence that's gathered from a satellite or signals or hacking computers necessarily, but talking to human sources, it looked like a raw, generally unfinished product, not quite a product. It's like, an update you might give to a client. Of here's what we're hearing so far. It didn't have a lot of conclusions. It had a lot of innuendo in it, which didn't make it particularly newsworthy, especially not if you figured out who was paying for it. This is a product that was originally financed by a billionaire named Paul Singer, who has a lot of ties to Israel. And this was set up, it was paid through the law firm of Perkins Coie that represents the DNC and the Clinton Foundation. So right there, we got some questions. And they subcontract to Fusion GPS, who in turn works with an old MI6 spy by the name of Christopher Steele, who was a Russia expert, but also a guy named Danchenko, who was a young man who very much appears to be Russian intelligence, and a guy named Chuck Dolan, who was a Democratic operative who had worked with the Clintons as far back as the 90s. He ran the Massachusetts Democratic Party, and most recently, he'd been working for Vladimir Putin. So that's the dossier, and that totally eclipsed the narrative of what the intelligence community was trying to tell us about, okay, we had Russian intelligence operations that influenced us. How much? that's hard for us to assess. We haven't got the tools on that. What's one of the reasons? A couple good reasons that the USIC wouldn't have tools to assess just how much the Russians had influenced an election one way or the other. One, they're not mind readers. They can't see inside your brain to see what crapola you saw on your dad's Facebook that influenced you. And two, they're not supposed to look at U.S. soil. The intelligence community is supposed to look out at other people, not in at us, with the exception of the FBI. And even then, it's not supposed to be a Stasi, East German secret police force that is listening in on your conversations over breakfast cereal. It's supposed to try and catch the foreign spies on our soil and possibly also the people, the American citizens that they might be working with. They're not supposed to study us like, zoo animals or something. So that's something we could not assess. We've got 18 agencies out there. There's a series coming on this channel. 18 different agencies. And they had no ability to assess exactly how much Russia impacted the election or not. Just that they tried and they did, and there were penetration of different machines all over the place, and there was definitely influence in the social media space. And then you have, over at BuzzFeed, you've got these photocopies of this document with the yellow highlighter on it that's just like, ooh, there's some sexual this, and there's this guy, Carter Page, and he's doing all this stuff. And here beginneth what Barr framed up as an investigation into the roots of Trump Russia, because you have 4 or so months after, the release of BuzzFeed's thingy, as well as the U.S. intelligence community report, and we had a few little, events along the way, like we find out Mike Flynn was talking to the Russian embassy on the run-up while Obama was still president, and then Flynn gets taken out. He gets, he quits because he's not entirely honest with everybody about having been in touch with the Russian embassy, specifically about, don't worry, we'll take those sanctions off you. Who cares what the current president just did? We remove him. But by May 9th of that year, 2017, Trump fires James Comey. Why? Well, we still haven't figured that out. Now, he does invite the Russians over to the Oval Office in a clear breach of protocol the next day, and says, well, I'm so glad I got that nutcase Jim Comey off my back. He was giving me trouble about you guys. As if he doesn't have an Israeli agent in his office as well, as if the guy who set up his campaign is an Emirati agent. He has the Russians over, and we just make it Russia, Russia, Russia. And here is where the framework of the Trump-Russia thing happens. It's like there had been a backlash to things like my thread that Trump has, and also the dossier itself, that Trump has connections to Russia, but that's crap. That's some internet stuff. Even though the intelligence community come out and said, I don't know, Russia definitely helped the dude. Why? Maybe they think he's cute. Probably more complicated than that. But, it was pretty clear by May when he has the Russians into the Oval Office. Oh my God, it's Trump and Russia. When in reality, it's Trump, Saudi, Egypt, Emirates, is all these different players that are part of this foreign attack on U.S. democracy. And of course, right after Comey's dismissal, we get this guy, Robert Mueller, who had been Comey's boss prior to that. He had been the second longest serving director of the FBI in history. And as you all remember, they looked at things for a couple of years and started dropping some very heavy indictments on folks. They start prosecuting Paul Manafort, Mike Flynn, Russian intelligence officers that are named first name, patronymic middle name, last name, stuff that's never happened before. There's clearly a whole lot of Russia going on. And today we know that Rod Rosenstein had been in there tightly controlling what Mueller could look at and what he could charge based on. It was so much tighter than like the Ken Starr investigation of Clinton, where he could go and investigate any molecule that had ever been on Bill Clinton's butt. Mueller wasn't given that. He was given a tight set of 4 questions that he could look into involving 4 individuals. And he still comes out getting enough to criminally charge intelligence officers. Something that never happened like that ever before. Unbelievable stuff. Now we're going to skip ahead to 2019 when Mueller's getting ready to present his findings. We, of course, get a new Attorney General, William Barr, who one of the first things he does in office is come out and give a blatantly prejudicial public statement about Mueller's work before it's been put out for Americans to just read and for other experts to look at and interpret for the public. Barr comes out and says, oh, he didn't really find anything. I mean, remember, we've indicted his campaign manager, who's connected to Russia. We've indicted his national security advisor, who had taken money from Russia. Everybody else too, but also Russia. They did Roger Stone. They did Russian intelligence officers. And then Barr comes out and says, oh, they didn't find anything, which this same media goes and reports kind of uncritically instead of going, hey, what are all the China, Opus Dei, Israel connections that Barr has? What's Barr been up to? Nobody looks at that. They're just like, oh, well, he's a Trump bad guy and he says that there's no Trump Russia. So maybe Mueller, we shouldn't have put all our hopes and dreams in him, as if that's, anybody looks to the FBI director, or much less the former FBI director, and 23 prosecutors for hopes and dreams. We usually use other sources of inspiration and faith. These are dry, very business-like government professionals generally. So the narrative framework that we were all just holding on, just hoping for Mueller to lift up our hearts and souls. It's not the fucking Hallmark Channel, people. This is the FBI and the DOJ. They're doing a tough job, usually in a very dry manner. So that's March 2019 or so. April 2019, Mueller puts out this 700-page book that I am one of 6 people that have actually read, and then he testifies in July. And if you read the book and you listen to the testimony, there was clearly a ton of completely inappropriate relationship between Trump and the Russian Federation and its intelligence services. If nothing else, you got to go check out the fact that Manafort hands off data from the Republican National Committee, incredibly valuable, down to the precinct polling data. He hands it off to Konstantin Kilimnik, who they describe in the news as a Russian military linguist. Guys, let me just, let's get into this. If anybody is a military linguist, they're a spy. That's it. They're not florists. They're not a barber. They're not an interior decorator. They're spies. That's what a spy is. That's somebody who studies foreign languages for the military. And if you're in Russia, you're never an ex-spy. You're a spy until they put you up the chimney or in a box. That's it. And that's not my words. That is the pep talk they give you on day one over there. So Manafort was working with this guy, Konstantin Kilimnik, who he'd known for years, who was a Russian spy. So very clearly they caught this. They caught these guys working with Russia. Now, did they work with all sorts of other foreign intelligence services? Yeah, it was really annoying, actually. But they work with Russian intelligence. And then the DOJ put a cap on who could get charged for what, so Mueller's hands are pretty well tied. And the news comes out and says, oh, well, he didn't find anything. And they write some snarky stories about some people had Mueller votive candles, and it was all very dismissive and very inaccurate. But around that time, Barr covers everybody's tracks, hires Durham to go look into the very dodgy creation of the Steele dossier, the Alpha Bank story, and how that disinformation ended up getting used in official FISA warrant applications by the FBI. And I think this is where we're going to have to table this for some more, another episode here. For all the various details. There's so much wrong with what went on with Crossfire Hurricane, with the FISA warrant applications on Carter Page, who turns out was a CIA asset for us. Doesn't mean he was an intelligence officer. He had been to the Naval Academy, and he had served his country in that manner. He may have been screwing around, and I don't know all the circumstances of it, but he may have been messing around, and he certainly had been targeted by the Russians in 2013. That's the kind of situation where our CIA might tap you and go, hey, how about you go fool around with them some more? But just tell us what they're thinking when you get back. That's being a CI or a confidential informant for the CIA. And this is the thing that really deserved Durham's attention and got plenty of it, and it's why they got a guilty plea out of a guy named Kleinsmith, who was assistant general counsel and who was the liaison between the FBI and the CIA, where the FBI asked CIA, hey, it's called Deconfliction, hey, is this your guy? We have this guy, he's messing around with spies, we see him around here. Is he one of yours? Is he kind of supposed to be fooling around with spies right now? And if the answer is yes, then you don't put a FISA warrant on that person, because that's an invasion of their civil rights, because they're serving their country, and we don't want multiple reporting streams there about what this guy is up to. Kind of let the agency that's handling that asset, we let them handle that asset. Well, the CIA said, yeah, Carter Page, he's one of ours. Believe it or not, guys, I know, the hat and all that. Surprised me too. Kleinsmith turns around, and he and his boss, James Baker, who ends up as general counsel of Twitter, by the way, after the fact, they lie about it. They say, nope, we talked to the CIA, everything's cool. And so they throw a FISA warrant on Carter Page and some other individuals, and the FISA warrant gets leaked to a Rupert Murdoch outlet, Heat Street. And that ends up as part of the narrative out there. And so turns out there's this whole relationship between the FBI that's investigating this stuff and the media. You are not supposed to compromise these investigations while they're going on. It'll make everybody act differently. So, when you back up and you look at what was going on in Crossfire Hurricane, what was the relationship between this counter-espionage team at FBI, and then later on, that same counter-espionage team and the Mueller investigation and the prosecutions, you understand why this could be a 7-hour video? There's so much going on there. And just to sum up, and we can get into this in greater detail in future videos here, Freudian slurp there. Durham ends up charging a number of individuals. He gets a guilty plea out of Kevin Kleinsmith, the assistant general counsel. He goes after an attorney who had been a DOJ employee but worked for the private law firm Perkins Coie, a guy named Michael Sussman, for lying to the FBI about, oh gosh, were the Clintons our clients? Geez, I can't remember. Very clearly he was lying. He said, oh, I didn't remember whether, we had told the CIA and the FBI that we really worked for the Clinton campaign, or if we were just concerned citizens. He was not convicted, but the whole story of how he was relating to the FBI and the CIA and trying to push this narrative, that was definitely worth inquiry, definitely worth investigation, and in my opinion, worth prosecution. And if nothing else, reading all the different pleadings from that case tells you there's a whole lot going on. Also, the story of how the Steele dossier was produced. So they charged a guy named Igor Danchenko, who appears to be a Russian intelligence officer who was in the United States and worked with this guy Chuck Dolan to create the Steele dossier through the Fusion GPS guys. Fusion GPS had been working for Prevazon, which was a front for the Russians. So bottom line, you had Clinton campaign operatives working with Russian operatives, financed partially by guys tied to Israeli intelligence. A lot going on there. But, if you look at if you look at the coverage of the New York Times, that the New York Times is pushing on Durham's potential public report, which may be a lot more impactful than the individual prosecutions that taught them so much. They're saying there's nothing to see here. And look, New York Times is the outlet that worked with somebody dirty at the FBI to say, investigating Trump, the FBI, which got 35,000 special agents, right? 15,000 analysts. All 50,000 of those guys saw no connections between Trump and Russia whatsoever, which was just unmitigated bullshit. So the New York Times does not get an opinion about this, not one that you should pay any damn attention to, since they are involved in some form of conspiracy. Maybe it was just a conspiracy to commit terrible journalism, but conspiracy nonetheless. Could be worse than that. So that's where we are. We're going to start talking about Durham. We're going to start talking about, geez, what kind of a culture did some parts of the FBI have such that the head of counterintelligence in New York felt like it'd be okay if he worked for a Russian oligarch? That's all very valid stuff. And do not let anybody on MSNBC or New York Times or anyone anywhere shut that down. And also, just because you see these super ugly figures on the right-wing side of propaganda, don't necessarily throw out the whole story, because that's the whole gag here. Is you have the truth, then you have people on the left who have an inaccurate version of it, people on the right who have a completely, totally inaccurate version of it. And, you know, the reality of this is very sticky. It is very complex. I mean, look, I could clearly go for 7 hours, right? We got to break this up. There's so much to learn here. You know, that it's not going to fit into easy sound bites here. So don't take any wooden nickels on that stuff. And there's going to be more to come. You know, it probably take me, again, another 6.5 hours just to get through in a condensed manner what we've learned so far from the Trump-Russia investigation and from Durham's investigation into the corruption thereof. But there's probably going to be more information that comes out of Durham. I'm certainly not going to be, ignoring it, and we'll be talking about it soon. But first, if you made it this far, why don't you hit subscribe if you're not already a subscriber? Click the bell to be notified, hit like, and my favorite part, ask some questions. You got to have a bunch of questions. How much was Hillary Clinton really involved in this? Did she know? You know, is Steele a bad guy? What does British intelligence think of him? I may not have the answers to those questions, but you should ask them. Other than that, I'm Eric Garland. You can catch me on Twitter at Eric Garland. Leave us a comment, and see you next time on Game Theory Today. Thanks.